Well, thank you all again for being here this morning. We're delighted to be with you all. My name is Murphy Miller, and I'm with the National Association for College Admission Counseling. And while I know the name NACAC, National Association, suggests that we are based in one nation, we are a global organization. We are a membership association that serves 27,000 college admission counseling professionals from over 70 different countries. We are based in the United States. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but we're really glad to be with you all today. Our goal as an organization is to empower college admission counseling professionals through education, advocacy, and community. And so we are very much aligned with the IC3 movement and really glad to be here and to contribute to this incredible programming. I'm joined by my colleague Clay, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I am an independent consultant and currently work with NACAC. It's a real pleasure to work with Murphy and his team to help advance the international engagement of NACAC. But I've been affiliated with IC3 almost since its founding. I'm on the board, so very proud to see how this organization has evolved and expanded. I see some familiar faces who've been involved with IC3 for a long time here. I also work with the IB, the International Baccalaureate, and I'm also here representing CIALFO, a college planning platform. So that's what I do.
Thanks, Clay. So we'll sort of be sharing in this presentation, which is really all about data. The idea is to empower you all in the work that you do, so you can go back to your school communities or campuses and leverage this data to make your lives easier and to empower your students on their journey to a post-secondary education. I should note NACAC as an organization supports anyone who helps students as they transition from secondary to post-secondary education across the globe. And so we have tried to inject sort of thoughts and insights and data from around the globe, but we will be focusing largely on applications to the United States. So while we will discuss applications from around the globe, we will largely be focusing on applications to the United States. So really, the idea behind this presentation is to allow you all to identify the latest trends impacting college admissions in the U.S. higher ed landscape, increase your ability to serve students through data-informed insights. Hopefully, you'll be able to discuss the future of the university admission counseling landscape, and I'd love it if at the end you'd be able to better understand NACAC as an association and what we might be able to do for you and your community. So we'll touch on NACAC really quickly. We'll do an overview of the data in terms of application and enrollment. We'll touch on recruitment and yield factors in the college admission landscape. We do a really great survey of U.S. universities to try to understand what you all are valuing as part of the evaluation process. And then we'll talk about some current trends in university admissions that are impacting the field. So NACAC was an organization founded in 1937. We're a preeminent nonprofit, non-governmental membership association devoted to university access. We, again, focus on the transition from secondary to post-secondary education, or if a student is transferring between two post-secondary institutions, but at the undergraduate level specifically. There are other peer organizations that might focus on admissions at the graduate level. We offer support through membership experience. I should note that I help to lead the membership experience at NACAC as well as global engagement. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer those. Training and education. We offer certificate programs and education throughout the year through webinars, but also in person. And we do a lot of policy and advocacy work. So we really try to amplify the voices of our 27,000 global members and ensure that we are instilling best practices within the field. We host a lot of events and conferences, and we also publish the Guide to Ethical Practice in College Admission. And I think, especially internationally, this is something that we're probably most well known for. This is a best practices document that really encourages counselors, admissions officers, students, family members to be ethical as it relates to the university application process. So if you're not familiar with that document, I would definitely encourage you to check it out. It can be a really great way to encourage your students and their families to move through the process in an ethical, student-centered way. Our mission is to empower college admission counseling professionals through education, advocacy, and community. And our lofty vision is that the transformative power of post-secondary education is accessible to all. We do have 23 regional affiliates. That includes international ACAC, which you all may be familiar with. So NACAC is sort of the umbrella organization, and then there are 23 regional affiliates that focus on different areas. And so, for instance, it could be a state within the United States, or it could be, in the case of international, the rest of the world. But we work very closely with those affiliates. We share a common goal. And really the idea is to give you both sort of a spotlight on your work sort of from a regional perspective, but also through NACAC get this sort of broader perspective on the college admission counseling landscape. So let's talk about some big themes in university admission. There's a lot going on. It feels like every single day there's something new in the news, just as it relates to U.S. university admissions. It's definitely been keeping us on our toes as practitioners and keeping us on our toes as an association that serves those practitioners. There has, generally speaking, been this theme where we've been emphasizing some level of flexibility and trying to remove barriers or sort of meeting students where they are. I think a great example of this has been sort of the advent of the enhancement of the test optional movement, which of course has been around for decades, but was really brought further very quickly by the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So this is the idea that students can, make the decision at this point at many institutions as to whether or not they want standardized test scores like the SAT or ACT to be a part of their application, right? And so that is removing barriers for a lot of students. I think it's encouraging, especially students who aren't sort of taking those standardized tests as part of their educational experience in school. It's sort of one less thing for them to do to navigate to a U.S. university. We're also seeing universities facing prospective student shortages. This is a result of what's sort of commonly known as the enrollment cliff, which is a very dramatic phrase, but basically suggests that the number of students graduating from high schools in the United States will begin declining actually next year. And the scary thing about this is we've been talking about it for a very long time, and now it's here. And so universities are sort of preparing themselves and having to think very strategically around how that might impact their ability to build their class. So chief enrollment officers at U.S. universities are having to be super thoughtful and intentional in terms of their recruitment practices in light of the sheer number of students that will be graduating from high school in the years moving forward. And we talked a little bit about this idea of the test optional movement in COVID-19, but I think what I hadn't mentioned is how it's really kind of renewed the focus on the core academic record. So how are students performing in the classroom? What is the rigor of their curriculum, right? And I think many universities believe, rightly so, that that is the best indication of student success on a university campus. And there's been lots of research around this, right? I actually worked at a university that went test optional back in 2016. We had lots of conversations around this. At the time, we were the largest research university to go test optional, and we did a lot of research to track how students performed on campus who did and did not submit test scores. And we were happy to find that we saw no statistical difference, significant statistical difference in their performance on campus. And so again, this kind of contributes to the discourse around how that core academic record is the best predictor of student success on a university campus. Of course, we could not be talking about US higher education without thinking about access and affordability. We understand that US universities are very expensive, especially if you're just looking at that sticker price, right? While we know that many students are not paying that full tuition, it is still a very daunting price tag, right? And so, especially as an organization that serves the college admission counseling community, we're thinking very strategically around access and affordability. We're also seeing increased selectivity and more ambiguity amongst what lots of folks like to call highly rejective or high prestige brands. These are the usual suspects that we've all heard of. And I think, what's happening here is there's a lot of conversation around the very most selective institutions in the United States. And in many ways, that sort of hijacks the conversation around selectivity in the United States. And we'll actually look at some data that helps us better understand the landscape as a whole, because it's important to remember that there are thousands upon thousands of higher education institutions in the United States, not just the ones that we hear about over and over again. And I should add that, in terms of this dynamic, you'll hear a lot throughout this presentation, sort of what's happening to high prestige brand name institutions versus what's happening to other institutions, institutions that are serving a regional population, or institutions that are public universities. Not all universities are created equal, and they're being impacted in different ways depending on sort of where they sit in the landscape. So we'll continue that conversation. And really quickly, obviously, this presentation would not be complete without us discussing FAFSA delays, which impact students who are applying for need-based financial aid on U.S. university campuses. There was a rollout on the part of the Department of Education this past year to introduce a brand new process. It did not go well. There was a lot of anxiety. There were a lot of missteps, and it was not a smooth process at all. And it had rippling effects on students' ability to access education. So that is a very real issue. Clay, anything to add here as we think about sort of these big themes?
No, I think you hit up on the key currents, just tying it to some global trends. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, what you international counselors are experiencing, you're at the cutting edge, because a lot of these trends you were experiencing first. For example, that flexibility in terms of admission. Many institutions, particularly large publics, went test optional well before COVID, but for international populations, before they expanded that policy for domestic. Things like the idea of affordability, and really, in a larger sense, value. I just want to link that to those demographic shifts that are occurring in the US are also occurring in other key destination countries like the UK, Netherlands, Australia, Canada. All of these countries are going through related, not the same, but similar demographic shifts and are responding differently. But for the most part, it means that one solution or one tactic taken on by universities is to globalize, that there are seats available for international students. But then related to that, I just want to underline one other thing you said about not only affordability, but perceptions of value. Those demographic shifts, which are really affecting more the global north than the global south, that I would consider South Asia, India being part of, in that your demographics are accelerating, are more dynamic, are more diverse. But in these established countries, that's creating tensions. And those political differences, and a quick plug for a session that Murphy and I and Paul Toulon and Rohan Pasari are doing this afternoon. We'll talk more about the politics. But with that, there's more scrutiny of higher ed and the concept of value. So not only affordability, but what is the return on investment, or what is the greater value of higher ed, is something that I think is streamed through a lot of the points you're making. So I'll pause there. I think that's a more global outlook.
No, I think that's great. And one thing we are hearing from our counseling members is that ROI is one of the top topics of conversation. You know, I'm only going to do this if then this happens, right? And I think it's important as counselors to be able to help students and families navigate that conversation. So yes, we will definitely be touching on that.
And to India, I just want to note that affordability, you know, for the US, folks think about employability. You know, are you going to get the job or have the lifestyle you want? I would say, especially from your students, it also extends to immigration opportunities. And so as the globe changes, there's a lot of discussion around, well, what, you know, how will immigration policies be impacted by some of these trends?
And I know we'll be talking about in the session later today, so come and check that out. Oh, we will also touch on this a bit later, but direct admission is a somewhat new concept still, although it's been a few years now. But it's sort of this. It's flipping admissions on its head. I have a few slides about it later, so we'll go into more detail and discuss whether it's a sort of longitudinal impact on the field or more of a flash in the pan. So my data team put this in because they obviously are the ones who collect all this incredible data, and they like to say, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And I would agree. So that's sort of the ethos of this conversation is, again, empowering you all to have data to back up the conversations that you're having with the students and families that you serve. Great. So let's dive into some of that data. And I will say the data that you see on this slide is from our very good friends at the Common Application. So I do want to note that this is demonstrative of roughly 1,000 institutions, member institutions that utilize the Common Application. So it's a pretty strong sample size, especially as we think about U.S. universities, and definitely suggestive of larger trends. And I would highly recommend leveraging the Common Application for data insights. They're really fantastic, and they have a very helpful team. So as we look at the 2023-2024 application cycle, we witnessed a 36% increase in applications when compared to pre-pandemic numbers. So that's a very significant increase, right? That is definitely keeping universities very busy as they seek to evaluate all of these candidates. And some of the increases, depending on the institutions, were really astronomical. We did see a 7% increase in the number of applications submitted per student, and it had increased nearly 10% the year prior. So year over year, students are submitting more and more applications per student. And I'm sure as folks who serve students directly, you're witnessing this yourself. I was saying we did a pre-conference workshop the other day, and I was talking about how I do a lot of these presentations, and I was giving a presentation at a public school in Virginia in the US, and a counselor was telling the story about a student who created 2 Common Application accounts. The Common Application does sort of cut you off after 20 applications, and the student didn't think that was enough, so they created a second account so they could submit 40 applications, which we see as an issue. There's no reason that a student should be submitting that many applications, especially if we are evaluating fit as part of the university search and application process. Because likely, if you are applying to 40 institutions, you don't understand your fit at all 40, and it's unlikely that all 40 of them are a great fit for that student anyway, right? So we are trying to encourage students and families to be a lot more thoughtful in the process, but gone are the days where students applied to 4 or 6 institutions and sort of left it at that. And of course, we're also seeing a trend in students applying to more global destinations. Even, students in the United States are increasingly exploring options outside of the US. So that might not even just be demonstrative of all the applications they're submitting if they're applying to multiple countries. And the dynamic that's creating is, of course, universities are receiving a ton of applications. They have a lot of work to do to evaluate all of those candidates, but it's a lot more difficult for them to anticipate which of those students are actually going to enroll because those students are just casting their net so widely. And I think really this comes down to a sense of anxiety and fear about the process, to give students some credit here, right? I think because there's ambiguity, because there's uncertainty, they're just throwing spaghetti at the wall and trying to figure out what's going to stick. And so I think our role as educators is to help them understand that they will find a place as long as they're building a careful and intentional university list, right? And what's interesting, and this goes towards what Clay was saying earlier, applicants living from outside the United States grew at triple the rate of applicants in the United States. And we're seeing top sending countries to the US are Canada, China, Ghana, India, and Nigeria. And we'll talk much more about the trends as it relates to kind of global applications. We're also seeing an 11% increase in underrepresented minority applications and a 4% increase in first-generation students applying to university, which we see as a very positive thing. This is demonstrating that there's access, although we want to continue that trend. We're also seeing significant increases in students demonstrating fee waiver eligibility. So these are students who qualify to have their application fees waived based on a series of eligibility requirements. So typically they're lower income students. And here's where we come back to this sort of haves and have-nots dynamic. Larger, more selective universities experience greater year-over-year application increases than other institutions, right? So we have this set of institutions that are getting a ton of applications, but we have other institutions in the United States that are not faring as well. However, I think for the first time last year, we're beginning to see a slight reduction in the growth of the most highly selective institutions. So this is just a chart that shows growth since 2015 in 2014-2015 application cycle in first-year applications. So you can see where we're headed here. It is really, really significant. And then here you can see the growth in first-year applications since 2014-15, but this is meant to demonstrate the number of applications submitted per student. And so you see this really interesting and pretty intense increase starting after 2019-2020. Students are just submitting more and more applications per student, right?
So the slide before was unique students.
Yes, this is unique students, whereas this is number of applications per student. Exactly. And then this is NACAC data that we harvest from our member institutions, post-secondary institutions, that just demonstrates, again, the number of applications that are being submitted per student. And you can see here, the red line is students who submitted 7 or more applications. The blue line is students who submitted 3 or more applications. So these numbers continue to rise, particularly as you look at the red line, which again is students who are submitting 7 or more applications per student. So it aligns quite closely to the common application data.
And so I want to touch on some data, and this draws from a couple of sources, but mainly Open Doors, which is produced by the U.S. Department of State through the partnership with IIE. I think we have representation for the Institute of International Education, which has a presence in this region. But a preponderance of international undergraduate enrollment in U.S. university derives from only a handful of countries. So that diversity or variety is still something that is very important. This does mimic trends in places like Canada, UK, Australia, these major destinations as well. But taking this data as being US, even with declines from China, and China, which had been the major sender, especially since around 2008. So with the election of Barack Obama, as well as that's a period of very strong economic growth and liberalization in China under Hu Jintao. In about 2008, China emerged as the largest sending country to the US, and years before that, it had become the largest sending country to undergraduate programs. It had always been a big graduate sender, but to places like the UK, Canada, and Australia. In UK, I think it was around 2005-06. It took a little bit longer in the US for that to happen. But as you can see from around this graph, 2008, China really ballooned so that more than 150,000 students were from China, and that's more than a third. There's been significant decline from China. Year over year last year, they lost 8%. The compound annual growth rate over the last 5 years is -9. So significant growth, decline of growth from China. But we've seen significant growth from India. Now, much lower numbers overall. So India this year, or the last year of reporting, was around 32,000 students compared to China, 100,000. So less than a third of China, but India, the trajectory is growing much faster with a year-over-year growth of 16%, and that compound annual growth of the last 5 years being 7%. So a significant growth from India, significant decline from China, but because of China's scale, China still represents about a third. Other countries that are dynamically growing, Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam, to a lesser degree Brazil, and then sub-Saharan Africa, particularly the Gulf of Guinea countries like Nigeria, in West Africa, Nigeria and Ghana, as Murphy said. Now, I want to tie this also to a trend that Murphy mentioned of not only the emphasis on curricula and the not only the emphasis on curricula and say the test optional or test free movement when you're looking at some publics, but in general, Murphy mentioned direct apply, and then the ability to give credit. So in some ways, the ability to, because of the growth area being in the global south, particularly India, Africa, Southeast Asia, to a lesser degree Southern Cone, these are much more cost-sensitive markets or countries, sending countries, than say the global north, like China, South Korea, Japan, parts of Europe. They were less cost sensitive. Now, they still do care about tuition, but not as much as students that you're dealing with. And one solution that universities are looking at is a more streamlined approach. And direct admission, I think, is part of that trend, not only for the US, but simplifying the way that students apply. The other is acknowledging the curriculum that they're in. So things like IB and standard level examinations or qualifications, as well as the CBSE and other state boards. The acknowledgement not only for admission, but you've probably seen sessions during this conference where there's efforts by university to give credit for a larger degree of qualifications that can make the degree more affordable, but also more flexible. So that's, I think, what I'll end on there. And patterns among U.S. states. So where are they going? California, New York, traditionally are the biggest recipients. Now, if you notice, California has significantly decreased. So a year-over-year decrease of 16%, and then a CAGR, or compound annual rate, of 9% decline. Why is that? Well, particularly the UCs have decided that they're going to concentrate on in-state students. This has affected even out-of-state U.S. students, that has created fewer places in those systems. So other states have benefited. New York grew a little bit, but if you look at the Sun Belt, Texas, Florida, and other states, so the Midwest and some states in the Northeast, like Massachusetts, which I highlighted there, have grown more as California has gone down. Let's go to the next slide. But overall, international students are well distributed in the US, but the coast benefit, as Murphy was talking about, a sort of tale of two cities. The coast typically have done better, but the Big Ten universities, the big R, what we call R1 or Research 1 publics, really receive the most international students. Universities like Penn State, Illinois, Michigan, Michigan State, the University of Washington, traditionally UCLA and Berkeley, but as noted earlier, those have been declining.
And earlier we touched on this idea of sort of factors in college admission and what are universities really valuing as they go to evaluate a student's application. And this is derived from NACAC State of College Admission Reporting. Little shout out to us. We do have some really wonderful data insights for our NACAC members. We give non-members a preview. So if you're not a member, you can access a lot of this info. But if you are a member, it gives you these really wonderful manipulable data dashboards where you can kind of look at this data on a much deeper level. But each year we send a survey out to our university members in terms of what are you all taking into consideration when it comes to the college application process. And I think these slides will be available, so don't feel like you have to take a picture, although you're welcome to. So here is really where we come back to this conversation about how the performance in the classroom, both in terms of rigor and their success or performance, is the most important part of a university application. But of course, as we know, the U.S. university application process is well known for being a holistic review, right? So they're not just looking at the performance in the classroom, but they're also considering all of these other factors, to include the students' essays, like their personal statement and supplemental essays, their counselor recommendation, which is where you all come in, teacher recommendations, extracurricular activities, potentially a portfolio or an interview, right? And what we like to point out here is the role in admission test scores that universities are reporting back to us. So back in the day, test scores were towards the top of this graph. In fact, it went grades in all college prep courses, grades in all courses, strength of curriculum, and test scores were the fourth sort of ranked important criteria when evaluating a candidate. It has dropped significantly, again, in large part due to the test optional movement, but I think also this recognition within the community that, again, it's not always the best indicator of student success on a campus. So as you can see here, only 4.9% of our respondents are indicating that SAT and ACT scores are of considerable importance. 25% are indicating that it's moderate importance, and 38%, or 39 if we round up, limited importance. So this graph I find to be really helpful when working directly with students and families. And in fact, I've had some counselors who say that they use it as their Zoom background when they're meeting with students. Others have said that they put it up on their wall in their office. It's a good thing to be able to point to ensure that students are thinking holistically about their application, but also thinking very critically about their performance in the classroom and that rigor of curriculum. And now this data comes from iPads, and it essentially supports what the NACAC data just suggested, which is, again, performance in the classroom is very, very important, and admissions test scores are really falling in terms of their importance in the university application review process. This data is interesting because it does break it out by public and private institutions, and there are some nuances there. So I'll give you guys a minute to take a picture if you need to, but we won't go too deeply into this data right now, because again, it's suggesting similar to NACAC, but it's always nice to validate your data. We also actually surveyed students in terms of what they thought was interesting or important as part of the university application evaluation process. And we found that students actually overemphasized the importance of admission test scores, as well as extracurricular activities and work experience, which of course are still important, and they should be involved in those things, but they actually felt like it played an outsized role in the application review process. And we found in the survey that students underemphasized the importance of strength of curriculum. And I saw this a lot when I was a university admissions officer and working as a counselor, that students aren't thinking as critically around that. And so it's an important reminder. They did accurately assess the importance of grades in all courses and college prep courses, as well as essays and writing samples. So it's just kind of interesting to get that student perspective. And I think you all can validate that this is sort of what you all hear in the conversations that you have with students. Now, this is one of my favorite slides. Again, this comes directly from the NACAC State of College Admission reporting, and this is an example of one of those manipulatable dashboards that you can access as a NACAC member. But this is demonstrating selectivity ratings amongst universities that we surveyed. And this most recent report, which was done in 2023, suggests that the average admit rate at universities surveyed is actually 73%. Now, I think if you were to ask a student or a parent what they thought the average admit rate for a US university would be, they would not be reporting 73%. I think they would quote a much, much, much lower number. And so what I find helpful about this data point is it starts that conversation around the fact that there are so many universities out there that are willing and waiting for students on their campuses, right? And that we consistently discuss the most highly rejective institutions, but there's so many other institutions out there. So our goal is to kind of introduce this concept to take some of the stress out of the room and to remind students that there are options out there. And actually in the United States, the average admit rate is 73%. Anything you want to add to this or the previous slide?
No, I think we're good.
And so this actually just shows, I find this interesting, this just shows that the average admit rate has actually been increasing over time. So the rhetoric is that universities in the United States are getting more and more selective, and there's this frenzy, and there's stress and anxiety, and no one's getting into university, when in fact the data shows the opposite. So again, when we focus on just a certain subsect of institutions, it can tell that story. But as you look at a wider picture, it is actually the opposite. So we've seen really significant increases in that average admit rate over time, and our data goes back to 2012. We saw a very slight dip between 2021 and 2022, but nothing significant. So this is important. Yeah, Sam.
Could you then make an assumption to say that if I make 10 applications, I'll get accepted by 7 schools?
Depends on that list. Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes, depends on that list. But yeah, I mean, I think it does come back to that conversation around creating an intentional list, right? If you're thinking critically, if your list is intentional, if you're ensuring you have a wide range of institutions you're applying to, you'll find a place. If you're only applying to a certain subsect of institutions, you might not fare so well. And you could probably find 10 institutions that will deny you across the board, right? But it really comes back to that conversation around a really thoughtful university list. Now, I mentioned earlier that the number of applications submitted per student is making university admission officers' jobs a lot more difficult, because they're having a harder time anticipating if a student is going to enroll, right? So in admissions, we call it the yield rate. It's the percentage of students who've been offered a place who accept their offer of admission. And of course, you want your yield rate to be as high as possible, which is why a lot of institutions utilize early decision, which is a binding agreement. It's an enrollment management tool that helps you kind of guarantee a section of your class. But as we think about non-binding decision plans, yield rates have been going down while admit rates are going up, which is interesting. And so, this is definitely something enrollment officers are thinking really hard about, because, as I said, they want to ensure that if they're going to admit the student, they want to come. There were many times where we'd be sitting around a conference table, throughout the evaluation process, that we realized that our jobs and our livelihoods in the state of the university rested on the decision-making process of a 17-year-old, which was sort of a scary thought to have. But this conversation really continues as those yield rates kind of continue to decline. And again, this comes back to the idea that as students submit more and more applications, it's harder to understand where they might ultimately enroll. Yes? Yeah.
Is there any way to get the real yield rate for a university?
Yes, iPads. So the National Center for Education Statistics, which is part of our Department of Ed, publishes that. Now it usually lags; it's a year behind. But for all U.S. institutions, there are about 2,000 degree granting four-year institutions, it would have that data, and we'll put the link. It's in a previous slide, but that data is available. Yield rates, acceptance rates. It doesn't break it down by different types of students, like international. At least that data set does not, but it would give you an overall picture.
Does that lead to a situation where, when you're evaluating, you might say, this guy looks too good for us, so we won't take him because we know somebody else is more prestigious?
Yes. I mean, universities aren't going to tell you that, but I can tell you, as someone who worked at a university, yes.
Well, and particularly for publics, because if you're not an in-state student, which is their priority, then that's public resources spent to try to recruit. So when they look at out-of-state students that they want to accept, they are looking at that yield rate and who they are likely to bring into Michigan, to Washington State, things like that.
And I would also note, this is a place where demonstrated interest might be utilized a little bit more heavily than in years past. And we are seeing that as sort of a trend in terms of the number of universities that are reporting that demonstrated interest, which is sort of that they track the engagement that a student has with them throughout the university search and application process, might be becoming more important as they review students, because again, they're trying to engage that students' enthusiasm to enroll.
And I think we want to move forward quickly. So this is a pretty dense slide. You'll have, I'll take responsibility for putting together something that's a little bit hard to read. So that's not Murphy, that's me. But what I want to emphasize, and then so we can move more to question and answer, because I think we're getting to that point. We have about 15 minutes left. But what I wanted to note was, you're probably thinking as Murphy is talking that large pool of U.S. universities, 2,000, are not necessarily what your students are applying to. That you're looking at a specific set of highly, Murphy was using the word prestigious, but highly prominent, highly ranked when you look at the QS or THE or U.S. News Report ranking. That said, and there are some shifts and trends, that tale of two cities that Murphy was talking about, but also the test optional policies. The Ivy League, which is a group of 8 universities that happen to play football together, there were some of those that went back. Harvard, Dartmouth, which Yale is test flexible now, and Brown, and then I believe, yes, and Cornell. So 5 of those 8 have now returned to requiring tests. recently Johns Hopkins, which is in Baltimore, as well as Stanford and Caltech. All of these institutions have returned to testing. That's about 10 institutions. But in the media and in rankings, they have a big impact on perception. In reality, though, Johns Hopkins is about 6,000 undergraduate students compared to some others. And I think a larger trend, which I wanted to show here, is that even though places that I just mentioned, the Ivy League or their peers, get a lot of attention, they don't receive the most applications. By far, the most applications in the US are coming to R1 publics, as well as some very large coastal privates that I wanted to point out, like Northeastern or NYU or Boston University. I would put, if I would have gone down further on this list, universities like where Murphy worked, GW, American University next door to them in DC, or USC would fit into this category, University of Southern California. These are larger privates that are much bigger than the ones I mentioned. However, they're creating some ambiguity there in that they're also becoming highly selective. But they're also increasing enrollment for the most part, particularly places like Northeastern, NYU. They have international campuses, and they have not returned to testing, and I think that's significant. It doesn't mean they won't in the future, but I think for now they're waiting and seeing. But also just in terms of their application and their yield, that they're actually the ones driving the application growth that Murphy's mentioned. So I wanted to clarify that even though your students are probably looking at a subset, I'm sure they include that. And I think there's a healthy ambiguity, whereas before you would definitely say, Cornell, being an Ivy League, is of a status better than NYU or Northeastern. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think there's a larger group of universities. Instead of being the top 12, folks are looking at 50, 100. And many of these institutions, particularly those R1 publics and then large privates, are fitting into that conversation. And they're fighting for your students. So.
Yeah, very important point. And I would also note that of the institutions that are returning to testing, in a couple of cases, there are provisions for international students, right? So that's an important thing to think about too.
Yep. And then I wanted to link that to international. So the data that I showed before were overall application growth. So a lot of that's driven by US growth. A place like Florida State does not receive many international students, but because Florida is a highly growing region, part of the southern part of the US, which is highly growing, is in that. These are the universities that, in terms of change of international undergraduate enrollment, not applications, but enrollment, these are the universities that have had the biggest shifts in the last 20 years. So from 2002 to 2022, this data lags because it is open doors, but that's the most recent reporting data. So NYU has had the biggest growth, followed by a number of R1 publics, particularly California schools like San Diego and Davis, Illinois, Penn State, these are Big Ten, Berkeley, and University of Washington and so forth. Boston University also there, I wanted to point out. Northeastern would be there as you go down, but hasn't grown quite as much as some of these peers.
And we've talked a lot about standardized testing, so I think we can skip that particular slide. And again, we touch on this subject, which is there really a return to standardized testing? But if you actually look at the broader landscape, the answer is no. So definitely something to remember. We've touched on direct admission really quickly. I guess I just want to explain what this is for those who might be less familiar. The idea is that this is flipping admission on its head, right? So rather than a student creating an application and choosing which institutions they want to apply to, students are actually creating like a profile, and it's sort of entering this clearinghouse of sorts. And so the student will suggest, talk about their academic background. They'll enter their interests. They'll provide information about their academic profile and other things. And universities can go through and actually understand what kinds of students are in this pool and they can directly reach out to the student and make an offer of admission to that institute, to that student. And what's interesting about this is I think it's actually a really wonderful way to get universities on a student's radar that might not otherwise think about that institution. And there's this great story profiled on NPR about a young woman who was looking for a nursing program, and she used direct admissions to apply to institutions. She got an offer from a university she had never heard of, but it was an offer of admission with a fantastic financial aid program. She researched them and actually realized they had a really incredible nursing program, and she chose to enroll. Right. So sometimes it just takes a little bit of a different perspective to think about options that might not already be on your radar. So some interesting work happening around direct admissions. As part of this presentation, we did interview members, so folks who are working on both sides of the desk. And one of our members, we wanted to understand what was happening in the field, how they were feeling. One of our members responded with this. So we understand that there's anxiety and angst, right? And that there's so much happening within the field. And we get it. And that's what we're here for, is to really support you all in your work as counselors. We'll switch over to Q&A, but I'll leave this up here, just kind of hanging around. We would love to have you join NACAC if you're not already a member. You will get these data-driven insights plus much more as part of your member experience. So we would love to have you on board. But I think in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and move to questions.
Yes.
Thank you so much. So most of the data that you have shown, is it like a sort of version where the US and the international students were considered equally? Or is there also an access to data where I can see the international admission rate, the yield as far as the international students go, and the admission rate, college specific and university specific?
So it depends on the university. In the US, there are some universities, like the University of California system, reports out in granular data on exactly what you're asking. Admission rates by category, not by country, but international would be part of that. Domestic, what they call domestic out of state, and then in-state students, they report out on all the categories you mentioned. Other systems, like I believe Illinois, reports on that level, but not all systems do. Now, there is a consortium called the Common Data Set, CDS, and recently that question has been added. This is not the department, so as opposed to the Department of Ed and IPEDS, where it's required, these are not required fields, so not all universities have completed it. But I think Murphy and I were talking earlier, there has been some a lot of talk about that data because there are differences. I would be careful, though, to make sure how you scrutinize that data is very important. Let's.
Thank you. The factors for a successful application that was mentioned here, just wanted to understand how much is the weightage of the curriculum in an application, like CBSE, ISC compared to the IB and the Cambridge A levels?
So I think, if I remember correctly, strength of curriculum was rated third on that list out of sort of grades in all courses and grades in what we call college prep courses or advanced courses. We don't have a breakdown in that data set around sort of how different curricula might be weighted by institutions. I think it's an interesting point for sure, but that's not something that we're capturing as part of that data set. I think universities will definitely have pretty honest conversations with students and families around how they look at curricula. And oftentimes they'll kind of include that on their website, or you can, ask them when you're in conversation with them. But that particular data is just kind of looking at advanced coursework more broadly. So yeah, it doesn't break it down quite that specifically.
Yeah. So why I'm asking is because basically we feel that IB's the strength is much higher compared to the CBSE and the ISC. And so we tell our children to strengthen their, the rigor of their curriculum by taking AP extra courses or maybe online courses through Coursera and all. So Is this a wise suggestion to give to our children, or let them be what they're doing?
It depends. The trend would be that universities are trying to understand the context in which the students are coming from, and did they challenge themselves with the most rigorous coursework available to them. And you're exactly right. And full disclosure, I work for the IB, so yes, gold standard, best curriculum ever, and your students should be doing IB. But from a university, my university colleagues in the room, most of them, and again, that movement is that what was available to the student in their local context, and did they challenge themselves with the most rigorous coursework? If a school offers both, say, CBSE and IB, then it would depend. I would say IB is better known right now in the US, so that could do it. Regarding adding supplemental coursework that is, or examinations that are not part of the coursework, like AP, I would say that unless they want that, unless they need that for credit, but IB receives that credit, that's not something that I would hear many folks recommend.
I have a follow up to that. Many of our students who are doing very well in their ISC exams, getting amazing marks, they're getting 99%, and still they are being turned down by the top, the dream colleges. And we see children who are from the IB background who have not exactly topped, or they have not in the top 1% of the country, and they're still getting the admissions. So, is there something regarding the normalization of the score that's happening when they're doing the application hygiene, that puts that 100% slightly lower, or a 99% lower than a very good IB score?
I think it's going to depend, and unfortunately, that's the answer you're going to get a lot of the time, because every institution approaches their evaluation process so differently, and in terms of how they sort of quote unquote recalculate student performance is going to vary drastically from institution to institution. It's going to vary based on the size of the institution, the ethos of the institution. So it really does vary. One thing I will note is I feel like there are really wonderful conversations happening amongst university colleagues and counselors around the recognition of other curricula. We know the IB very well. To Clay's point, it's super well known. But I think it's important that we also recognize there's other curricula out there, and universities really need to take the time to understand what that means, what that entails, how rigorous it truly is. Just because you've heard of something doesn't mean it's necessarily the only option. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think a lot of important conversations are taking place, both in terms of how we acknowledge local curriculum in different country contexts, and also how that curriculum is recognized from a credit perspective. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just take it from there, because I represent an IB school, and I think we also have these disappointments when we say that what is it that the universities are looking for, like a 45 pointer also faces this kind of a disappointment when they don't get into their dream school. So I really don't know what is it that the universities have as their parameters when they look for admissions. So my question is around the test optional. So there were schools which were test optional even pre-COVID, and after, during that time, a lot of schools still, to convince students, it's a slightly difficult task, that if a particular school is test optional, students still feel that if we have a test score and the rest of the list, probably I'll have an edge over that. So do we have any kind of data where the acceptance shows that we are test optional school, and this is the data where we have accepted students with no test scores versus test scores?
Some universities give data on that because it's so contextual, and you're talking about so low numbers.
Thank you.
When Northeastern is admitting 6%. I think let's see, I think we have NYU in the room, but they're in that range, right? 5 or 6. I'm not to put you on the spot. 5 or 6% you're admitting. So it depends, and I would be careful about how that data is used when you're counseling. But in general, it's not about test submission, but if you have a very, very high score that's above the middle 50 range that is reported, and most universities do report an ACT, SAT, if they accept it at all. Now, there's a lot of the universities that we have mentioned that are completely test-free, and so you should not be submitting there, because that could actually disadvantage the student. But for those that are optional, I would look at that middle 50. The other thing to consider, because many of your students in India are applying to math-heavy coursework, So that's where, and again, it's not any test score, but a high test score could help differentiate if there's other part of the academic record, say the IB scores, do not fully reflect that, then having that very, very high ACT or SAT could help. So that's where I would caveat. Yeah, yeah, Paul.
We're over time, unfortunately. I know we could talk about this all day. The good news is I'll be in the exhibit hall for the remainder of the day. So if you have more questions, you can come find me there. I'm at the NACAC booth. We just want to thank you all for your time, attention, engagement, incredible questions.
And one thing I want to thank Murphy for is Murphy was instrumental in getting a partnership between NACAC and IC3 to perform this sort of, or this professional development. So I think this is something in our IC3 community we're very happy about. So thank you, Murphy. Have a great conference, and do come to our session this afternoon.